She built a legacy the world could not ignore. A voice that filled theaters, a presence that reshaped Broadway, and a career that dominated charts for over 6 decades. Barbra Streisand became more than a star. She became a standard of greatness. But behind that brilliance lived something far quieter, far more personal. Beneath the applause and the iconic smile was an emotional depth she has spoken about more openly in later years. Experiences shaped by relationships, expectations, and a search for something more complete. Now, at 84, she is no longer turning away from it. For the first time, she begins to reflect on the emotional weight of a relationship she once believed would define her life, and a marriage that left a lasting impression over time. Not just memories, but something that continued to influence her perspective, her choices, and the woman she became. This is the story rarely told, the perspective she carried quietly while the world celebrated her victories. Before we go further, take a moment. What does she mean to you? If you had to measure her life not just by success, but by what she experienced along the way, how would you define her? Because for all her triumphs, one truth remains. The thing she searched for most may not always have come in the way she expected. Her earliest memories were not filled with warmth, but with absence. An emptiness that lingered in the dim, crowded Brooklyn apartment she called home. In August 1943, when she was only 15 months old, her father Emmanuel died suddenly following a medical emergency. It was swift, merciless, and permanent. She would grow up without any personal memory of him. No voice, no embrace, only fragments of a life she never had the chance to know. Years later, she would describe that absence with quiet devastation, as if he had barely existed in her lived experience. The only traces left behind were a few belongings, preserved like pieces of a life cut short. Her mother, Diana, struggled deeply after that loss. Over time, grief and emotional strain created distance, making it difficult for her to offer the kind of affection her daughter needed. When Barbra was 7, her mother remarried. But even that transition felt unclear and abrupt to a child trying to understand her place. A man named Lou Kind entered her life. He was not a source of comfort, but someone she experienced as distant and emotionally unavailable. She tried anyway. Small acts of devotion, calling him father, moving carefully around him in hopes of earning approval. But nothing changed. The rejection settled into her like something difficult to shake. Years later, she would reflect on that feeling with painful simplicity. She never felt truly accepted by him. The home itself offered little refuge. It was cramped, suffocating, and stripped of privacy. She shared a room with her mother and brother, with no space to retreat, no place to dream, no door she could close. It wasn't until she was 16 that she experienced something as simple, as powerful, as having a room of her own. That absence of space left a mark, one that would later be reflected in her appreciation for beauty, control, and environments that offered the calm she had never known as a child. But perhaps the deepest wound came from words. Her mother's voice, instead of comfort, could be critical in ways that stayed with her. She was told she wasn't traditionally pretty, that her features didn't fit conventional standards, that her voice, so unmistakable to the world, might not lead to success. Expressions of affection were rare. And yet, within that constant pressure, something unexpected began to grow. A quiet defiance. A fragile but persistent belief that what made her different might one day become her strength. Those early experiences did not disappear with time. They followed her into adulthood, influencing the way she approached relationships, the way she sought validation, the way she entered her marriage with Elliott Gould, where the desire for connection met the emotional patterns shaped in childhood. Even as she stood before thousands, draped in elegance, holding awards while the world celebrated her, a part of her remained rooted in those early years. A girl from Brooklyn, still searching for a sense of being enough. The moment she left Brooklyn behind, Barbra Streisand wasn't stepping towards certainty. She was stepping into uncertainty, with little more than determination to guide her. At 16, she arrived in Manhattan carrying a worn suitcase and a voice that many around her had underestimated. There were no goodbyes filled with assurance, no clear path laid out ahead, only the echoes of doubt she had grown up with. Reminders that she was too unconventional, too different, too unlikely to fit the expectations of success. For most, those words might have built a wall. For her, they became fuel. New York did not welcome her gently. It tested her in ways that demanded resilience. She moved through modest rooms and shared spaces where comfort was limited and stability was never guaranteed. There were periods when money was tight, when meals were simple, and when daily life required constant adjustment just to keep going. And each day brought the same ritual: auditions, rejections, closed doors. Not because she lacked talent, her voice carried something distinctive, but because she did not match the image many decision-makers were looking for. There were moments that could have discouraged her completely. Casting rooms where her singing filled the space, only to be followed by polite dismissal or hesitation. Comments that focused more on appearance than ability. One voice after another suggesting she would struggle to succeed. Not with that look, not with that presence. The message was clear: change, or risk being overlooked. But she chose neither. She held on to something far more difficult: authenticity. She refused to reshape herself into something more acceptable. Later, she would reflect on that choice simply. If she failed, it would be on her own terms. That decision came with a cost. Nights stretched long with uncertainty. At 17, in a small rented room, she held on to the fragile belief that what she carried inside her mattered, even when it went unrecognized. Outside, the city moved forward, full of energy, of opportunity, of voices already being heard. Inside, she faced the quiet fear of never breaking through. No connections, no guarantees, only persistence. And yet, change rarely arrives with certainty. It begins in moments so small they almost go unnoticed. In 1960, at 18, she stepped onto the stage of a modest club in Greenwich Village. No grandeur, no expectations. Just a dim room, a few scattered listeners, and a young woman who had nothing left to prove, only something to express. She sang not to impress, but because she had no other way to express herself. This time, something shifted. The room responded, not loudly, not all at once, but enough. People leaned closer, conversations softened, attention gathered, and for the first time, the world didn't turn away from her. It paused, it listened, and slowly, it began to remember her name. Success did not arrive gently for Barbra Streisand. It accelerated quickly, sudden and undeniable. By 1962, at just 19, she stepped onto the Broadway stage in I Can Get It For You Wholesale, and the girl once described as too unconventional became impossible to ignore. Audiences were captivated, critics took notice, and a new name began to circulate through theater circles. But recognition did not always bring ease. With every applause came pressure. Voices suggesting she might be a temporary phenomenon, whispers that she didn't quite fit established expectations. The rejection she had once faced in silence had simply changed its form. Still, she refused to retreat. The very traits she had been urged to hide. Her unconventional beauty, her distinctive voice, her relentless will, became the foundation of her identity. And even as her career began to rise, the insecurity she has spoken about in later reflections did not fully disappear. The memory of that young woman in a small Manhattan room remained, quietly reminding her how uncertain success could be. Then came Funny Girl in 1964, a role that blurred the line between performance and something deeply personal. As Fanny Brice, she embodied the outsider who succeeds not through perfection, but through authenticity. The connection was undeniable. By 1968, when she stood at just 26 years old holding an Academy Award for the film adaptation, she had reached a height few could imagine. Broadway, Hollywood, music. She had achieved remarkable success across all of them. And yet, beneath the triumph, something else began to take shape. Success, for her, was never simple. That Oscar did not feel like release. It brought new expectations. From that moment on, every step forward carried the awareness of how much could be lost. She held herself to an exacting standard, focusing on every detail, every note, every frame. What had once been passion became something more demanding. She would later reflect that performing was no longer just expression. It carried the pressure of meeting expectations she set for herself. And as her fame grew, so did the scrutiny. The press watched closely, often amplifying both praise and criticism. The world celebrated her brilliance, but it also questioned it, challenged it, analyzed it. In that spotlight, perfection became both a form of protection and a responsibility that grew heavier over time. Through the 1970s, while she shattered box office records and collected Grammys, tabloids often portrayed her as difficult, demanding, even impossible. Comedians mocked her nose. Columnists criticized her ambition. To the world, she was a star. But in parts of the media, she became a punchline. For a woman who had grown up searching for affection, those words could carry lasting impact. People see the glamour, she later reflected, but they don't know the hurt. They don't know how words can wound more than silence. One of the most difficult moments came in 1967, a year before her Oscar triumph. In front of more than 130,000 people at Central Park, she forgot the lyrics mid-performance. The experience shook her deeply. Though her voice remained strong, her confidence was affected that night. She later recalled the moment with honesty. "I remember standing there. I couldn't move. I couldn't sing. The fear stayed with me. The impact lingered." For many years, one of the greatest singers of the 20th century stepped away from large-scale live concerts. Not until 1994, at age 52, did she return, facing a live audience again after decades away from that stage. Even her boldest victories carried tension. In 1983, she directed, co-wrote, and starred in Yentl, becoming one of the first women in Hollywood to hold such creative control over a major film. Though critics praised the project, reactions were mixed. Some industry voices labeled her too controlling, too ambitious. Where men were often described as visionaries, Barbra was judged differently. "I wasn't trying to be powerful," she later said. "I was just trying to tell the story the way it lived inside me." The double standard was real, and its impact stayed with her. She is the only artist to achieve a #1 album in every decade since the 1960s. But with each release came pressure. Would this be the moment the momentum changed? Would time finally shift the balance? Each success carried expectation, and expectation carried weight. So while the world saw gowns, Grammys, and Oscars, Barbra experienced something more complex. The challenge of being fully understood, the pressure of maintaining excellence, the emotional cost of a life lived in constant visibility. She stood in one of the brightest spotlights in entertainment, yet still navigated the quieter, more personal side of that experience. That is the paradox of Barbra Streisand at her peak. Achievement alongside pressure, triumph alongside uncertainty. She reached extraordinary heights, yet never completely escaped the voice of self-doubt. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate. Because even at the top, the space can feel isolating, the expectations relentless, and the role difficult to carry. But the most personal challenges were never public. They unfolded in the private spaces of love, where success offered no guarantees. And for Barbra Streisand, that reality became most visible in her marriage to actor Elliott Gould, a relationship that began with intensity, grew alongside rising fame, and eventually struggled under the weight of it. They met in the early 1960s when both were still climbing the uncertain ladders of theater. Elliott had an offbeat charm, boyish, irreverent, unwilling to be dazzled by Barbra's voice or unconventional beauty. That unpretentious steadiness drew her in. "He was one of the first people who really saw me," she later reflected. For someone who had grown up without her father, that kind of attention carried deep meaning. In March 1963, at just 21, Barbra married him quietly, without spectacle. Friends saw it as impulsive. She saw it as something more personal. Their early days were intimate and ordinary. Small New York apartments, secondhand furniture, takeout cartons balanced on their knees, late-night rehearsals ending in laughter. For the first time in her life, Barbra experienced a sense of belonging, not to an audience, but to another person. But that balance proved fragile. By 1964, Barbra's career accelerated rapidly with Funny Girl on Broadway. Elliott, himself a talented actor, began to feel the difference in visibility between them. As her schedule grew more demanding, so did the pressure at home. By 1966, when their son Jason was born, the distance between their daily realities had started to widen. Barbra deeply loved her child, but she was also navigating film commitments, recording sessions, and an increasingly intense workload. Elliott hoped for more time together. Barbra feared that slowing down could jeopardize everything she had worked for. "I was torn," she later admitted. "I wanted to be a mother, but I was afraid that if I stopped, everything might disappear." Even moments of happiness carried tension. The nursery filled with Jason's cries while Barbra was working, and Elliott, caring for their son in the early hours of the morning, began to feel the strain of their shifting roles. As the late 1960s moved into the early 1970s, tension gradually turned into distance. Elliott struggled with the imbalance created by Barbra's growing fame. Barbra, in turn, felt the weight of that tension and the cost it carried. They tried to hold things together. Short trips, promises to spend more time, efforts to reconnect. But the gap remained difficult to close. By the time she stood holding her Academy Award in 1968, their marriage was already under significant strain. The public saw a young woman at the height of success. Behind closed doors, Barbra and Elliott were navigating disagreements about time, responsibility, and how to maintain a relationship within a life that no longer moved at the same pace. By 1971, the marriage ended. Barbra was only 29. To the tabloids, it was another celebrity divorce. To her, it felt deeply personal. It was like a loss, she later reflected. She had entered that union hoping love could heal childhood wounds, and left with the realization that love alone was not always enough. Yet from that ending came something she held on to. Motherhood became a role she refused to neglect. She protected Jason with intention, determined to give him what she felt she had missed: consistency, support, and care. When Jason came out as gay in the 1990s, Barbra responded with public support at a time when that was far less common in Hollywood. She spoke openly in favor of LGBTQ rights, supported related causes, and used her platform to advocate for acceptance. "My son taught me courage," she later said. "He showed me what unconditional love really means." In Jason's honesty, she found a reflection of something she had long valued: authenticity. Whatever impact her marriage had left, motherhood became a space where she could express that more fully. Years later, when asked about Elliott, Barbra did not respond with bitterness. Instead, she spoke with perspective. "He was my first great love," she said. "That doesn't disappear." For all their differences, Elliott had been an important part of her life. Their relationship was complex, sometimes difficult, but also formative. It was where she experienced the tension between ambition and intimacy, between public success and private connection. And so the marriage of Barbra Streisand and Elliott Gould remains part of her story, not simply as an ending, but as a defining chapter. It was a relationship that brought both closeness and distance, and one that shaped how she understood love moving forward. For Barbra, the most difficult challenges were not always public. They existed in the private moments, balancing work and family, navigating expectations, and managing the emotional demands of both. The applause outside did not remove those pressures. But within that experience, she found something lasting. Even in difficult relationships, there can be growth. And from that period of her life came something enduring. Her son, Jason, and a deeper understanding of what love requires. The end of her marriage to Elliott Gould had already shown Barbra how relationships can be affected by the pressures of fame. And soon after, another chapter would emerge. One shaped by attention, speculation, and the complexities of working closely with Omar Sharif during Funny Girl. It was 1968, and Barbra's star had never shone brighter. On screen, as Fanny Brice, she shared a striking presence opposite Omar Sharif, the magnetic screen legend whose charm matched her intensity. Their chemistry was evident, compelling, difficult to ignore, and extending beyond what was written in the script. To audiences, it felt like magic. To some behind the scenes, it suggested something more personal. The timing could not have been more complicated. Emerging from a marriage that had ended and stepping into global stardom, Barbra found herself balancing newfound attention with increasing public scrutiny. Tabloids amplified rumors, turning speculation into headlines. What should have been a defining moment. A film that solidified her place in Hollywood was accompanied by stories that blurred the line between performance and personal life. For Barbra, who had built her identity on authenticity, her voice, her presence, her refusal to conform. The connection with Omar was not something she later dismissed. She acknowledged their chemistry with openness, without trying to reshape how it was perceived. There was no need to overstate it, only to recognize that it existed. In the end, Omar returned to his life, and Barbra continued with hers. Whatever existed between them did not last, but the moment stayed with her. A reminder that even at the height of success, she remained open to connection, to risk, and to emotions that did not always fit neatly within public narratives. By the mid-1970s, Barbra Streisand had already experienced the end of a marriage and the pressures of public speculation. What she had not yet encountered was a connection rooted as much in intellect as in emotion. That possibility appeared in an unexpected place, through Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. Their worlds could not have been more different. She was an artist whose work expressed emotion openly. He was a political leader shaped by discipline and control. And yet, when they met, there was a connection. Quiet, thoughtful, and distinct from the intensity she had known before. Trudeau brought something different into her life. Reserved, deliberate, and intellectually engaged, he interacted with her not as a public figure, but as someone whose ideas mattered. She later reflected that he made her feel understood in a way that public recognition could not. For someone who had long valued being seen beyond fame, that carried significance. Their connection developed privately, through conversations, shared time, and correspondence shaped by demanding schedules. They spoke about more than surface-level topics, about culture, responsibility, and the pressures that come with influence in different forms. Those who observed them noted the contrast. Her expressive energy alongside his composure, his steadiness alongside her intensity. It was not dramatic, but it was balanced in a way that felt new. For Barbra, it was a glimpse of connection without performance. No spotlight, no mask. Just the quiet honesty of two people drawn together by respect and curiosity. And yet, the same realities that made their bond meaningful also limited it. Trudeau was tied to his role as a national leader. Barbra was committed to her career. Neither could step away from the life they had built. And so the relationship remained brief, meaningful, but not lasting. Years later, Barbra spoke of him with respect, not regret. What remained was not heartbreak, but a sense of something unfinished. A reminder that not all connections are meant to fully develop, even when they matter. If her time with Pierre Trudeau reflected a more thoughtful, intellectual connection, Her relationship with Don Johnson in the 1980s represented something very different, a romance shaped more by visibility and energy than depth. By the 1980s, Barbra Streisand had already been a star for over 2 decades, her name associated with consistency and achievement. But even at that stage, she was not immune to the pull of a different kind of connection. And in that era, Don Johnson embodied a certain kind of Hollywood appeal. He was charismatic, widely recognized, and rising in popularity through Miami Vice. To the public, they formed an unexpected pairing. She, an established figure, he, a younger actor gaining momentum. Their appearances together drew attention, and for a time, the relationship became part of the broader Hollywood conversation. Their time together was highly visible. Public events, premieres, and media coverage that amplified their presence. For Barbra, who had often navigated being misunderstood, that kind of attention could feel different, less analytical, more immediate. But what appeared dynamic in public did not necessarily translate into something lasting in private. Their connection was shaped by timing, by lifestyle, and by different expectations. Where he embraced the momentum of rising fame, she was looking for something more grounded. The relationship ended without major conflict, but with clarity. Their paths did not fully align, and what they shared was not built to last. In retrospect, Barbra did not frame it as a failure, but as part of a broader understanding. Some relationships are brief, and that does not make them meaningless. If Don Johnson represented a moment shaped by visibility and energy, then Andre Agassi introduced something entirely different. An unexpected connection defined by contrast, attention, and a dynamic that few could have anticipated. By the time the 1990s arrived, Barbra Streisand had already achieved what most could only dream of: success across Broadway, film, and music. There was little left for her to prove. And yet, life had another unexpected chapter, one that had less to do with awards and more to do with the unpredictable nature of relationships. It began in a way few anticipated, with Andre Agassi, a rising tennis star nearly 3 decades younger, whose world was defined by competition and intensity. Their connection drew attention. To outsiders, it seemed unlikely, an established cultural icon and a young athlete at the peak of his ascent. But to her, it was something more immediate, a connection that did not follow expectation. What brought them together was not similarity, but contrast. Agassi, known for his drive and public image, responded to her presence with openness and curiosity. And she, in turn, recognized something in him that felt direct and unfiltered. He did not approach her as a symbol, but as a person. For a time, their relationship offered a different kind of experience. Conversations, shared moments, and a sense of stepping outside the roles both were known for. But differences remained. Their careers, their life stages, and the attention surrounding them created pressure that was difficult to sustain. The relationship did not continue long-term. Still, it left behind something of value. Not permanence, but perspective. And then, at a point when relationships had often been complicated by timing and circumstance, something different emerged. In 1996, at 54, she met James Brolin. There was no spectacle, just an introduction arranged through mutual connections. Neither entered it with expectation. What followed developed gradually: conversation, shared values, and a pace that felt steady rather than intense. He did not try to change who she was, and she did not need to explain herself. The dynamic was different, less driven by momentum, more grounded in understanding. She later described it in simple terms: he listened, not just to what she said, but to who she was. And for someone who had spent much of her life navigating visibility and expectation, that kind of attention carried weight. When July 1st, 1998 arrived, the story of Barbra Streisand entered a quieter, more personal chapter. In the gardens of her Malibu home, surrounded not by spectacle but by intimacy, she married James Brolin. There were no grand theatrics, just close friends, family, roses in bloom, and a sense of calm that had not always been present in her life. She wore a luminous Donna Karan gown, but what stood out was not the elegance. It was the ease in her presence. For once, the woman who had spent decades under scrutiny appeared less like a public figure and more like someone at peace. Their marriage did not resemble the relationships that had come before. There were no headlines driven by conflict, no public unraveling. Instead, what followed was something less visible but more enduring: consistency. They built a life shaped by everyday moments: mornings over coffee, walks along the Malibu coast, time spent at home rather than in constant public view. In a world that had long required performance, she found space where she did not need to perform. Family became part of that life, not through grand statements, but through presence. Though they did not have children together, their lives intertwined. She connected with his children, including Josh Brolin, while he supported her son, Jason Gould. What they built extended beyond structure. It was sustained through time, attention, and shared commitment. The absence of shared children did not define what they had. What made their relationship notable was not intensity, but durability. In an industry where relationships often shift under pressure, theirs continued over time, years turning into decades. He did not compete with her identity, and she did not need to reshape herself. Over time, she came to understand something different: that love does not require perfection, but the ability to accept and be accepted. She later reflected on this with perspective. For years, she had questioned whether lasting love was possible for her, that her life, her career, and her past might make it difficult. And yet, in this relationship, she experienced something steadier. His presence offered balance, his humor created ease, and their dynamic became something she could rely on. Decades later, their life together continues with a lower profile than the chapters that came before. It is not defined by spectacle, but by continuity, shared routines, familiarity, and a connection that does not need to be constantly seen to exist. For those who followed her journey through ambition, pressure, and personal change, this chapter stands apart. Because what she found was not a fleeting moment, but something that lasted. Not a performance, but a partnership. Not applause, but a form of peace. But in the end, the story of Barbra's heart was not defined by scandal. It was a story of endurance, of finding a partner who chose her not for the public figure she became, but for the person she had always wanted to be. And it is within that quieter, lasting connection that her other achievements take on deeper meaning. The home she built, the objects she collected, the wealth she accumulated. These were not simply displays of success. They reflected something more personal. Each space, each detail, carried a sense of continuity, a way of shaping an environment she could control after a life that often felt exposed. For Barbra Streisand, material success was not only about luxury, it was also about preservation. Holding on to moments, experiences, and identity in a tangible form. A reflection of what she had moved through and what she had created for herself over time. If her relationship with James Brolin brought stability, then her homes and collections provided something equally important: grounding. They were spaces shaped intentionally, not just aesthetically, but emotionally. Her Malibu estate remains one of the most recognizable parts of her personal world, not only for its scale, but for what it represents. Spread across multiple structures near the ocean, with gardens, ponds, and carefully designed landscapes, it reflects a deliberate attention to detail. Less like a display, more like a private retreat shaped over time. It was there she married James Brolin in 1998, choosing a private ceremony over spectacle. It was also a place she remained connected to, even during challenging moments, including regional wildfires. And within that space, she created an environment where design and personal meaning intersected. "My home is my canvas," she once said. And in Malibu, that idea took form. New York, too, marked an important part of her journey. Her Upper East Side townhouse, once valued in the tens of millions, reflected a different phase, one tied to her early rise and long-standing connection to the city. For a time, her Central Park West residence offered a view of the city where her career began, now seen from a very different position. These were not just properties, but markers of progression, spaces connected to different stages of her life. A movement from a modest upbringing in Brooklyn to a presence within some of the most established neighborhoods in the country. Even her choice of cars reflected changing phases. A 1962 Bentley S3, with its classic design and craftsmanship, aligned with a period of refinement in her career. A contrast to the earlier years when her life was defined by simplicity and uncertainty. The sporty 1976 Mercedes-Benz 450 SL reflected a period of independence during the years she directed and starred in Yentl, a film that marked an important moment for women taking creative control in Hollywood. And then there was a restored 1926 Rolls-Royce, maintained with the same meticulous attention she brought to her work. It was not simply a vehicle, but a symbol, a reflection of how time, like craftsmanship, could be preserved and cared for. Much like she had sustained her voice, her artistry, and her presence across decades. Yet, her most distinctive collection may have been the one that revealed her personality most clearly. Her private collection of Americana. Dolls, vintage furniture, and rare artifacts, all carefully curated and displayed in themed spaces she designed beneath her Malibu home. It was unconventional, even eccentric to some, but it was also deeply Barbra. "I like to live with history," she once said. In preserving these objects, she was also preserving stories, both cultural and personal. This collection became both a personal retreat and a statement that beauty could exist in objects once overlooked or forgotten. In a way, the act of restoring and curating mirrored her own experience, redefining value where others had once dismissed it. To outsiders, these homes and collections might appear as the visible rewards of success, but on closer look, they also reflected a deeper narrative, of someone who had moved beyond early limitations and created spaces that offered control, meaning, and continuity. Every detail, from architecture to gardens to carefully chosen objects, carried intention. They were not simply expressions of wealth, but of authorship over her own environment. And perhaps that is why, even as critics described her as demanding or particular, Barbra's legacy in this space feels distinct. She did not accumulate for visibility alone. She shaped, restored, and designed, using her resources as a form of personal expression. Her homes were not built to exclude the world, but to create a space where she could exist on her own terms, beyond constant scrutiny. In the later chapters of her life, Barbra Streisand stands not just as an icon, but as a woman who has redefined what success can mean. With a fortune estimated at over $400 million, she remains one of the most accomplished figures in entertainment history. But numbers alone cannot fully define her story. Her wealth is not confined to accounts or investments. It exists in the spaces she carefully shaped. Homes filled with history, collections preserved with intention, a private world built piece by piece as a response to everything she once lacked. Every garden she cultivated, every room she designed, carries the imprint of a life that sought to transform absence into something meaningful. But the deeper truth lies beyond material success. The most meaningful legacy she created was not something that could be bought. It was something she built quietly over time. It lives in the mornings shared with James Brolin, in the enduring bond with her son Jason Gould, in the sense of peace she gradually allowed herself to feel. The homes she created were never just symbols of status. They became sanctuaries, places where the noise of the world could not reach her, where the girl who once felt invisible could finally feel safe. Because in the end, What defined her life was never applause. The stages fade, the awards lose their shine, and even the greatest achievements become memories. What remains is something far more intimate. The relationships she nurtured, the love she learned to give and receive, the quiet commitment to show up for those who mattered. She discovered that love is not found in grand gestures, but in persistence, in staying when it would be easier to leave, in listening when pride demands to speak, in protecting what is fragile even when the world is not gentle. Her journey, from a childhood marked by absence to a life shaped by connection, reveals a pattern that repeats in different forms. First, the courage to be seen without hiding. Then, the courage to love her child without conditions. And finally, the willingness to extend that compassion outward, using her voice not just to perform, but to support and uplift others. That is the arc that defines her. Not fame, not fortune, but transformation. Because wealth can build houses, but only love creates a home. Talent can open doors, but only presence invites others inside. Fame can amplify a voice, but only meaning gives it depth. Her legacy is not simply a list of achievements. It is a way of living, resilient, intentional, and open to growth, even after decades in the spotlight. And now, her story reaches beyond her. Which part of her journey resonates with you most? The strength to begin again, the patience to endure, or the courage to give? If her voice has ever stayed with you, share your thoughts. And tell us, from 0 to 10, how you would measure not just the artist, but the person she became.